You open your eyes to the cold echo of cathedral bells, their toll rising through the dawn mist of El Escorial. Candle smoke curls through the corridors like ghostly incense, and somewhere beyond the marble pillars, a newborn wails. The cry of a prince who will one day drown his kingdom in sorrow. For now, you smell sanctity and power. Later, both will rot into the same scent of decay. Before we begin, take a moment. If you love unearthing the forbidden corners of history, give this story a like and join our growing circle of curious minds. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, whether you're in Madrid, Manila, or Montreal. Because tonight, history's darkest secrets are being told across every time zone. The year was 1784. Spain was weary but still magnificent. Its empire stretched thin from the Americas to Asia. In the monastery palace of El Escorial, built of gray stone and cold piety, Queen Maria Luisa of Parma gave birth to a son, Ferdinand, heir to one of Europe's oldest thrones. The bells rang in triumph, priests murmured prayers, courtiers bowed until their foreheads nearly touched the marble floor. The desired prince, they called him, El Deseado. But in the very walls that celebrated his birth, envy and deceit were already nesting. Ferdinand's childhood unfolded not in warmth, but in whispers. His father, King Charles IV, was a man of soft temper and slow decisions, a monarch more comfortable in the hunt than in the council chamber. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa, was his opposite in every way, sharp-tongued, commanding, and fiercely protective of her favorite, Manuel Godoy, a young guardsman whose rise from obscurity to prime minister scandalized the Spanish court. In the flickering candlelight of those halls, the boundaries between governance, desire, and deceit dissolved. Courtiers spoke in murmurs, eyes darting toward the queen's private apartments where Godoy's shadow lingered far too long. To some, he was her advisor. To others, her lover. To young Ferdinand, he was an intruder who had stolen not just his mother's affection, but his destiny. "Your Majesty," Godoy once dared to say before the council, "Spain needs a steady hand, not the trembling one of hesitation." Charles IV smiled weakly, pretending not to hear. Maria Luisa's lips curled into something that wasn't quite approval, not quite love, a silent warning to all who opposed her favorite. And Ferdinand watched, always watching. In the gardens of Aranjuez, he learned to smile while listening for betrayal. In the chapel, he prayed, not for virtue, but for vengeance. As a boy, he was often described as pale, sickly, reserved. But beneath that stillness, a hunger coiled like a blade being sharpened in the dark. At meals, when Godoy's name passed between the courtiers' lips, Ferdinand's eyes would lower to his plate, his fork stilling in his hand. Once a tutor overheard him muttering, "One day he'll bow to me." But power in the Bourbon court was never won with open defiance. It was cultivated through deceit. The Queen's affection for Godoy had transformed him into a monarch in all but name, signing decrees, moving armies, deciding marriages. Ferdinand, the legitimate heir, was kept from affairs of state. His letters censored, his advisers dismissed, his movements watched. Yet exile within the palace did not break him. It taught him the lesson that would define his life, that betrayal was not a crime, but a currency. He began to gather his own circle of confidants, disillusioned nobles, clerics, and courtiers who whispered of liberating the prince from his mother's poisonous influence. At night, their meetings flickered by candlelight in secret chambers of El Escorial. The plans were still childish, their ambitions reckless, but the seeds of conspiracy had been planted. Meanwhile, the empire outside the palace was fracturing. Spain's armies faltered in wars it could no longer afford. Colonies stirred with unrest, and Napoleon Bonaparte's shadow grew across Europe. In Madrid, famine followed inflation. In the streets, beggars wrapped themselves in the tattered red of old military coats, the last color left of Spain's fading glory. And still, inside the palace, the queen held her masquerades. Diamonds sparkled, violins played, and Godoy, dressed in the silks of his own ambition, danced while the empire decayed. Ferdinand's hatred matured in those years like wine sealed too long, darkening, souring, fermenting into something dangerous. He began to write secret letters to foreign envoys, testing the waters of rebellion. Some found their way to France, to men who would one day serve under Napoleon himself. The young prince, not yet 20, was ready to betray his parents in exchange for a throne. But before rebellion came exposure. One cold night in 1807, royal guards burst into his chambers at El Escorial, searching his drawers and desk for evidence of treason. What they found, letters, names, and plans, shattered what remained of the royal facade. The next morning, Ferdinand was placed under arrest. His mother wept not from sorrow but from rage. His father declared him a disgrace. The corridors that once echoed with his childhood laughter now rang with the heavy steps of soldiers. Outside, courtiers whispered that the prince had conspired with Napoleon himself to overthrow his father. And perhaps, in his heart, he had. For days, Ferdinand refused to speak. Then, like so many times in his later reign, he yielded not out of remorse, but calculation. He wrote letters of apology, begging for forgiveness, calling himself the most miserable of sons. The king relented. Godoy advised mercy, a mistake he would later regret. Ferdinand was freed, but mercy, once granted, only deepened his hatred. In the years to come, Spain would see revolution, betrayal, and war. And the boy who had once watched the court's corruption from the shadows would step into it, eager to master the very poison that had made him. As the bells of El Escorial toll again, marking another royal birth somewhere in history, one question lingers like smoke over cold marble. When a child grows up in a nest of serpents, does he learn to kill them or to become one himself? Night in Madrid smells of incense and rot. The palace, that gilded cage of royal fantasies, breathes like a dying creature, its velvet curtains swaying with the sighs of ghosts. Within its walls, Ferdinand VII lies awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling's painted angels, as if daring heaven to watch what hell is about to begin. The whispers began with the servants. Candles snuffed too soon. Dresses torn in silence. A queen's rosary found tangled in her bedsheets. They said His Majesty was not a man, but a punishment, a living wound Spain had to bear for its sins. And yet, by dawn, the court orchestra played as if the night had not screamed. His first queen, Maria Antonia of Naples, arrived bright and frightened, a jewel from the south thrown into the cold marble of Madrid. She tried to please him, speaking softly, crossing herself before bed, even whispering, "Mi señor, que Dios le bendiga," when he turned away. But Ferdinand's gaze was not that of a husband. It was the gaze of a child pulling wings off a butterfly, curious to see what suffering looked like up close. The queen's health decayed quickly. Her laughter, once echoing through the galleries, thinned into coughing fits. When she died, barely 21, the court called it consumption. The maids called it deliverance. Ferdinand wore black for a week, then smiled as if nothing had happened. He told a priest, she was too delicate for this world. The priest did not answer. Spain was cracking outside those palace gates. The colonies bled rebellion. The army muttered discontent. But Ferdinand's attention drifted only between the chapel and the bedchamber. The confessor who urged him to repent was dismissed within days. The physician who mentioned sterility was exiled to the countryside. No one dared to name the deformity that shaped his nights. By the time his second wife, Maria Isabel of Braganza, arrived from Portugal, the walls themselves seemed to tremble with dread. She was gentle, devout, and barely 20. She spoke of art and faith, restoring paintings in the Royal Museum. When she became pregnant, Madrid dared to hope for an heir, and perhaps redemption. But in childbirth, something went wrong. She bled out on the marble floor, her last cry swallowed by the bells of Almudena. Ferdinand was seen later that night pacing the halls barefoot, muttering prayers in a voice that was not quite sane. The people had started to call him El Rey Criminal, the criminal king, and yet who among them could guess the extent of his cruelty behind those brocade curtains? The courtiers avoided his gaze, the priests avoided confession, and the painters refused to capture his likeness in full light. Rumor said he forced the maids to wash him as one would cleanse a corpse, that he locked his third wife, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, in her chambers for refusing his advances. The girl was 16. She spent her wedding night crying beneath the portrait of Christ, whispering for mercy. Still, Spain bowed. The empire decayed, but etiquette remained. Each new bride was presented like a relic to a dying faith. Each new dawn carried the same scent of incense, blood, and silence. The king aged grotesquely. His features sagged, his eyes turned jaundiced, yet his vanity deepened. He ordered tailors to reshape his uniforms, painters to erase his deformities, and guards to silence any gossip that dared escape the palace walls. Then came Maria Cristina of Naples, the fourth queen, the survivor. She was shrewd where the others had been innocent, steel beneath lace. She endured the grotesque theater of royal duty, smiling while the court watched her every move. But she understood something no one else did. The king's weakness was not only of flesh, but of fear. She began to maneuver quietly, aligning allies, whispering to generals, playing the saint while plotting the salvation of her unborn child. Outside, Spain convulsed. The Carlist factions sharpened their daggers, loyalists and liberals tore the nation apart, and famine crept through the countryside. Ferdinand sat on his throne, wheezing, surrounded by portraits of ancestors whose gaze seemed to accuse him. When he finally realized his own mortality, he tried to rewrite succession itself, declaring his daughter Isabella heir over his brother Carlos. It was not an act of wisdom. It was desperation. He wanted the world to remember his seed, even if his soul rotted. In his final days, Ferdinand's screams echoed through the palace. The curtains drawn tight, his attendants stood in terror outside the door. Some said he saw the faces of his dead queens at his bedside. Others claimed he begged for water that turned to blood in his hands. When the bells of Madrid tolled for his death in 1833, few wept. The servants burned his bedsheets, the queen's portraits were veiled, and the windows of the royal chamber were open to let the stench escape. But Spain was not freed that day. His death was only the end of a body. The disease he spread ran deeper. Civil war ignited. Brothers turned against brothers in the name of succession. And in the whispering corridors of the palace, the curtains still moved at night, as if something inside refused to rest. The monster was gone. But his breath lingered like incense overwrought, a reminder that some kings die not as men, but as curses that keep their nations burning. The corridors of the royal palace of Madrid smelled of lavender and death. Velvet curtains hung heavy as if suffocating under the weight of secrets. Behind them, Ferdinand Sicilianeth, the king once called El Deseado, the desired one, sat like a ruin of flesh wrapped in gold. The years had not merely aged him, they had devoured him. His body had swollen grotesquely, his voice rasped like metal dragged on stone, and his eyes glimmered with something between pain and perversion. The courtiers still bowed. The priests still blessed him, but no one dared to look too long, for the closer one came to the king, the more one saw what Spain had become, a kingdom ruled by deformity, both physical and moral. They called him husband. Yet every queen who crossed his threshold would pray not for love, but survival. Maria Antonia of Naples had been the first, young, bright, and doomed. She came with laughter and perfumes from her homeland, speaking of music, of gardens, of God. Within a year, her joy had curdled into whispers and tears. The servants told of cries muffled behind chamber doors, of a queen who refused to share her bed and a king who took refusal as rebellion. When she died in 1806, barely 21, the court said illness. But the maids said otherwise. Ferdinand wore black silk for a month. Then he smiled at her funeral, as though burying her were an inconvenience finally resolved. His second wife, Maria Isabel of Braganza, came from Portugal, pious, artistic, radiant in her belief that she could bring beauty to a broken man. For a while, the palace bloomed again. She founded museums, restored paintings, even coaxed her husband into attending Mass. But Ferdinand was never a man who could live in daylight. He watched her with suspicion, jealous of the attention she gave to saints and canvases. "You speak to the dead more than you speak to your king," he once murmured, eyes fixed on her trembling hands. When her labor went wrong, when her child and her life slipped away in the same hour, Ferdinand did not weep. He ordered her body dressed in white and locked the room for 3 days, refusing to allow anyone to touch her until the stench forced the doors open. Outside the palace, Spain was crumbling. Rebellions flared in the Americas, soldiers starved in the streets, and the nation's wealth flowed like sand through a torn sack. Yet Ferdinand's world shrank to the size of his bedchamber, its tapestries, its velvet, its cages of gold. He grew more isolated, his mind decaying with his body. The physicians dared not speak the truth. The king's maladies were not curable. They were him. By the time Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony arrived, she was 16, a pale child sent to tame a beast. Their wedding night was the stuff of nightmares whispered among maids. The queen, trembling before a crucifix, refused her husband's touch. Ferdinand, humiliated, ordered the priests to lecture her on duty. For months she lived in terror, retreating to her chapel, her prayers echoing through the halls. One night the guards reported hearing sobs followed by silence. By morning she was gone, dead of what they called nervous exhaustion. Each death stained the throne a deeper shade of red. Each funeral hymn sounded less like mourning and more like warning. And then came Maria Cristina of Naples, the fourth queen, the last and the most dangerous. She was no innocent. Beneath her lace and pearls, she carried a survivor's cunning. She played the role of nurse, consort, confessor. She soothed his temper, endured his grotesque appetites, and waited. While Ferdinand decayed, she quietly gathered influence, forging alliances with generals and priests, whispering of her unborn child. The king, desperate for an heir, adored her, or rather the illusion she spun for him. But outside, the fires of rebellion had already caught. The Carlists, loyal to Ferdinand's brother Carlos, prepared for war. Spain trembled, split between bloodlines and beliefs, and within the palace, the king, oblivious to the chaos, spent his nights in rituals of decay. He demanded the curtains stay drawn, claiming light burned his eyes. He forbade mirrors, saying they lied. The servants said he muttered names of the dead queens in his sleep, calling them back to him. When his daughter Isabella was born, Maria Cristina seized her moment. The king, fragile and raving, signed the pragmatic sanction, disinheriting his brother and naming the infant as his successor. The ink had barely dried when his hand began to shake uncontrollably. "They'll come for her," he whispered, staring into nothing. "They always come." His final days were an opera of horror. The air of his chamber thick with rot, his breath shallow and wheezing, he demanded his confessor read to him from the Book of Kings. "David sinned," the priest murmured. Ferdinand chuckled weakly. "Yes," he rasped, "but God loved him still." When the bells tolled his death in 1833, Madrid did not mourn. The people filled the streets, not in sorrow, but relief. His servants burned his bedsheets. His portraits were veiled. Yet the curse he embodied did not end with his breath. The Carlist wars erupted, a storm of blood over the crown he had twisted beyond repair. And in the darkened royal chamber, the curtains moved though the windows were closed. The candle flames bent sideways, as if something unseen had passed between them. The maids froze, hearing a whisper, hoarse, broken, familiar, curling through the air like smoke. It spoke no words, only the rasp of labored breathing, wet and slow, echoing off the marble. Some said it was the wind trapped in the drapes, others crossed themselves and fled. The scent of decay lingered, mingled with incense as though the room itself refused absolution. The monster was gone, they said, but his ghost remained, still reaching through the fabric of Spain, one trembling hand at a time.